Hello, mate to Thrive Nation. We've got a very special guest on the show, Britt Frank. She's an author of a brilliant book called The Science of Stuck. You can actually find it on Take-A-Lot for all my African listeners and viewers, and obviously on Amazon and many other areas that you can find books. But I'm really grateful to have her on the show. She's a licensed neuropsychotherapist, very experienced in internal family systems and somatic experiencing and somatic therapy. So it's wonderful to have you on the show, Britt Frank.
Thank you so much for having me.
Brilliant. I want to start with a very, very important quote on your website that I read, and I just want to read it carefully because I think South Africa is a very traumatized country. Africa is a very traumatized country, and we're going through a lot of things from the past, with apartheid and the new generation of, the unity of Africans and those that have come international for many, many years over the hundreds of years, and all the atrocities that were done and the truth and reconciliation, process that happened. But your statement says trauma is not defined by what happens to you, but how your brain interprets safety and danger. So just in your own words, I know you've got an incredible backstory that I want to go into, which is very, very profound. And thank you for being so vulnerable with that in your book. It's an incredible story. But just define or just unpack that term that you've had on your website.
Sure. And a lot of people tend to get very angry very quickly, reasonably, when they see that, wait a minute, trauma is what happens in my brain. Like it's my brain just obviously, if we're talking things like oppression, atrocities, genocide, war, assault on either a personal level or a collective level, global, there are things that are bad. There are events that are inherently traumatic, which is why, especially nowadays with trauma being such a buzzy, quote, trendy word, as a trauma expert, it's really important to me to define what we're talking about. So a traumatic event is those events that I just listed, things that we can all get together and agree are bad. Like they are bad. There is no subjective interpretation. Assault is bad. Genocide is bad. All of those things are bad. Trauma, as that word is defined, is the internal process. I like to call it the brain's digestion process. So if you're subject to a traumatic event, which is the external, your brain is reasonably going to not metabolize that. Just like if you were to ingest contaminated food, you're going to get sick. Like maybe there are a few people who don't get sick when they eat poisoned food, but generally the majority of us, when exposed to bacteria in our food or a traumatic event, are going to experience trauma. But that said, you can also experience trauma, the internal brain indigestion process, from events that nobody would ever even think of as traumatic. Now, that doesn't mean I'm comparing them. So let's say you get into a minor car accident and suddenly you can't sleep and you're shaking and you're sweating and you're panicking. I'm not comparing a fender bender to genocide. I am saying that our brains do brain things, and what gets coded in one person's body as indigestion might not necessarily be for the other. And on the reverse, you can be exposed to traumatic events and not actually get PTSD and not sustain long-term trauma, just like you can be exposed to something that we wouldn't necessarily code as a traumatic event, and nevertheless, here we are. So a traumatic event is the external, trauma is the internal metabolic, quote, the way I frame it, process.
Okay, so that's pretty profound. So what you're saying is certain people can experience an event like a car accident, and it doesn't cause trauma in their bodies. And I refer to trauma as a wound. And you're referring to that wound in the brain system, which is very interesting because I've been a doctor of Chinese medicine for 24 years now. I've dealt with a lot of patients with regards to functional medicine and using all different types of techniques, from functional medicine to ozone to acupuncture to herbal medicine, which has been very sort of profound and helpful for my patients. But it's just interesting how someone can have a car accident and it can someone else got injured or the car was written off and they don't have that wound, or the wound is very small, that they just normal life and daily, they just process it and it doesn't cause a long-term wound that causes a trigger. While others have a wound, a deep wound that causes significant problems, especially with regards to car accidents. So why are certain people, firstly, they have an event and it causes a wound, it causes a deep wound that then they have to deal with and process in order for not to trigger certain sort of behavioral coping mechanisms?
Sure. And I wish I had a neat and clean answer to that.
Mm.
I can tell you it's certainly not a question of strength versus weakness, or a good person versus a bad person, or a moral person. It's not about anything logical or anything cognitive. Our brains and our bodies are made up, and you know this, of just the nuance is infinite. Genetics, environments, childhood, caregivers, family of origin, community support, levels of external resources, level of internal resilience, which can be defined by lots of things and mitigated by lots of things. You know, someone with really, really strong, you know, internal organs who is super healthy might have an easier time with a psychological trauma. I'm not saying that's always the case. Certainly that's not always the case. But why some people experience trauma and others is way too complex for anyone really to answer. My short, very reductive answer is because our brains our brains do brain things. And often much of what our brains do is automatic. It's often subject to generations of behavioral patterns of thinking, being, and doing that are passed down. A trauma from my great-great-grandmother could be impacting me today, whereas you don't have that same trauma from your great-great-grandmother. So exposed to the same stimulus, we both react differently. So rather than why did this happen, or why is my body reacting like this, which is an interesting question, a much better approach is, what are my options? What are my resources in this moment to help myself get back to baseline? Because we can answer the why and still feel stuck. We can answer the why and still feel terrible. So rather than why the trauma, what's our solution, and what are my choices in this moment? The why question is important and it's interesting, but it's certainly not the first line of defense when you're suffering.
For sure, and I've heard you speak about the building's on fire. We're not looking at why the building was on fire. Let's just get the flames down. And that comes with any patient or client that I see is someone's bleeding. I'm not going to ask like why. Just stop the bleeding, stabilize the patient or the client, and then we can ask the why question.
Right. And someone, I love my social media community. Someone pushed back. Well, you need to know why a fire started to know how to put it out, because if it's a chemical fire versus a wire, okay, fine. Well, then we don't need to know why the building is on fire to get the people out. You don't need to know why the accident happened to get the bleeding person to the hospital. So I got called on that metaphor. So fine. You don't need to know why a building's on fire to get a person out of it.
Yeah, brilliant. And so, and let's carry on with that trauma, because I think it's really important. I'm not sure how much you know about DBT. I've been exposed to dialectical behavioral therapy and the emotional mind and the rational mind. It seems that those that are highly sensitive characters and personalities and are sitting on the emotional mind, and that's speaking from someone who's got the rational mind, you know, thinking of myself and my wife, you know, she sits on sort of the emotional island, I sit on the rational island, and we try and, you know, go to each other's islands and reach out and all those things. But are the caring and very sensitive, super sensitive people more sort of vulnerable to traumatic events?
So as a HSP, as a self-identified highly sensitive person who has complex childhood trauma, you know, emotional, sexual, like all of it, and again, I don't have any numbers to back this up, but I certainly think anecdotally, not necessarily that we're more predisposed to traumatic events, but that we are more predisposed to having that internal brain indigestion, regardless of the severity of the event. And I'll give you an example. This happened last night. So for people who are like, oh, I get to a place of healing where I'm good. Like, no, this is whatever day we're in. It's 10 o'clock in the morning. This happened at 7:30 last night. I took a dance class with my husband. I haven't actually taken a dance class where you're changing partners in a classroom, and it was dark and it was hot, the AC was off and it was sweaty, and I was switching partners, and all of a sudden my nervous system started panicking and shaking, and I'm in the car dry heaving, and it called back a sexual trauma that I thought I was done with. Apparently not. And so as a highly sensitive person, my nervous system is primed to react very quickly to anything that resembles a trauma from the past. And it was a great dance class, and I'm going to go back. It just caught me off guard. But it's important to know, if you are a highly sensitive person, not to shame yourself. If I had started experiencing those symptoms last night and then went, what's wrong with me? This is so stupid. It's a dance class. I'm here voluntarily. Everyone's really nice. What's my problem? I would actually amplify the cortisol that was already coursing through my body. And I would exacerbate the problem, then create a shame loop, and then probably go into a maladaptive coping strategy, which is what I used to do. But it's still helpful to know if you're highly sensitive, sensitivity is your superpower. Just lean into it. You're not, it's like trying to fight the ocean. You're not going to win. So you might as well lean into it and just go with what are my best choices in this moment.
Well, let's unpack that. I mean, what happens if someone does have a car accident and, like, for the person that was in the car accident with them, they find they've got over it, they've processed it, they can drive, and the other person can't. Now, what do they do? I mean, you talk about micro choices, and your book is brilliant about that in terms of what choices do you have available to you, because what you're doing is you're sort of down regulating the nervous system. And I still want to talk about why you speak about the brain specifically, because I think that interests me. But let's talk about what that person can do from a choice perspective. In the car, they're trying to process this wound or this trauma. The other person's got over this sort of event. And I suppose you can't even call it a traumatic event, but we'll talk about that as well. There's a lot of questions. But what does that person do from a choice perspective?
Sure. And I would call that not a traumatic event. I would call that a trauma-inducing event. So a traumatic event is something high-level bad. A trauma-inducing event is something that's an everyday or neutral thing that nevertheless creates that reaction. So from a choice perspective, not everyone has access to trauma specialists. Not everyone has access to a community of supportive, holistic practitioners, but everyone in any moment has access to validating that your brain is on your side. Like, your body is not fighting you. Your body is not attacking you. I hate that in our zeitgeist, we call panic an attack, because we battle depression. We fight addiction. I'm having a panic attack. All of these war metaphors assume that the enemy is within. And that is a terrible orientation for downregulating a nervous system. Let's start with, I feel like crap. Everything feels like it's on fire. I feel like I'm going to die. And my brain is on my side. My brain is on my side. My brain is on my side. Because if you start with the assumption that your internal organ is attacking you, nothing is going to downregulate. You're set up, your trajectory is to crash from the jump. So let's start by just assuming your brain is on your side, even if it doesn't feel like it.
Well, now that is profound. Those war words, what we're saying to ourselves, our inner selves, hang on, this is a battle, a fight against a protective or a response against this sort of wound and this trauma, or trying to deal with this. And now we're battling that very, very manifestation.
I mean, the whole framework that we view mental health, mental illness, trauma right now starts with the assumption that the enemy is within, and it is not. You know, I don't like the war metaphors and the enemy metaphors, period. But if we're going to use them, let's start with the problem is not inside you. The problem is outside, and we want to partner with our brain. I tell people, imagine the possibilities if all the voices in your head could get along, and they can. Even if you feel like, and I'm not minimizing the pain of panic or the discomfort of trauma. It's awful. It's debilitating, and it can be life-threatening. Nevertheless, it is not a sign that your brain is attacking you. Even if your brain has an injury and it feels like it's attacking you, our brains are set up to self-protect. They're not wired for happy. They're wired for survival. And sometimes we have to reprogram and relearn what that means, because we're not always being attacked by lions, even though it feels like it.
That's true. Now, I want to talk about this rational mind and emotional mind in dialectical behavioral therapy, because some people go through an event. Maybe they go through, and I'll give you an example. One of my patients, their father had cancer, and he's got this rational mind. Her brother's having a freak out and having this massive, like, trauma-inducing effect that causes a trauma, and he's cool, calm, and collected. Now, which one is almost the dysfunctional, because this person is so disassociated from the emotional being that they're actually like rationalizing that everything's fine, and the other person's receiving this inducing trauma that causes a wound that they have to process. How do the two come together? Because I think it's very, very important, because we always sort of call the abnormal, oh, you're freaking out, you're dramatic again, you're all emotional again. These are very common words that people use. But how would you frame that?
And this is the problem with DBT. And for the record, I love dialectical behavior therapy. My symptoms in my 20s would have been classified by traditional like psychotherapeutic models as borderline personality disorder, which I later learned was complex trauma. But since I thought I had borderline, I went through DBT because that's what you do. DBT is fabulous. I think everyone with a brain who has to go through adolescence should be in DBT because it's, and for people who don't know, there are 4 general pillars: mindfulness, distress tolerance, emotional regulation, and interpersonal effectiveness. And it's not a trauma healing modality, it's a skills-based modality, which is really important because when you are in a freak out, you're not going to be able to simultaneously heal the trauma while you're building, your brain is on fire. So DBT is put the fire out. It doesn't heal trauma. It's not I don't consider DBT a healing modality. I consider it a coping modality, a put the fire out modality. So then you can get to root cause resolution and not just symptom management. So that's my thing. So with your comments, DBT is split into wise mind and emotional mind. And then, the center, the Venn diagram is where things tend to work better. But like you said, the problem is we've learned to pathologize our reactivity when often our reactivity is our brains doing what brains are supposed to do. You're supposed to freak out when, like in my dance class last night, like that was the right reaction. It was the wrong situation. It was a mismatched reaction, but that's the right reaction. It's just that that reaction is like 10 years delayed from when it probably needed to happen. And that's fine. So we want to be careful not to codify wise mind and rational mind as one is good and one is bad. Yeah. Going into dissociation is really appropriate if you have a job to do. So let's say that you're in a really horrific environment and you have children. You don't have the luxury of being mindful and present at that moment. You need to dissociate consciously in order to get those kids to safety or whatever you need to do. So dissociation in DBT would be classified as bad, but it's not. It's not so simple as good, bad, right, wrong, wise, emotional. We need to really nuance and look at context before we start labeling things. Okay.
Let's go on to the next question. Was you say trauma to the brain? In South Africa is like one of the most unsafe countries. There's a lot of crime. There's a lot of upheaval here. And so a lot of people never feel safe in this environment just because they've got high walls, electrical fences, they've got alarm systems, they've got guards and security guards walking the streets. It's a really fight, flight, or freeze type of environment it is. I mean, I think Bloomberg rated it the 2nd most stressful country to live in the world in 2015. And we've just seen significant sort of distress. I like to call it distress rather than stress, but distress in this country. So why do you say trauma happens to the brain and not really to the brain and body?
Sure. And when I say brain, that's all encompassing. The brain is the central command center of the central nervous system and our extremities and our cells, organs, and tissues. So when I say brain, I'm including all of it. Now, the environment that you described, I wouldn't even put that as like, you can't have PTSD until there's a P, which means like PTSD is post-traumatic stress disorder. But if you're currently in an unsafe environment where at any moment something terrible could happen and that hypervigilance is congruent with the level of threat in your environment, that's not you experiencing an internal injury. That's right now you are in an unsafe environment. So trauma healing is not available. And that's not a personal, again, that's not a strength versus weakness. Then the question is, given the realistic threats to your physical safety, what are our choices for mobility? What are our choices for feeling as good as possible in that particular moment? But it's really hard to heal from trauma when you're constantly being subject to that trauma.
Okay, so what do you recommend with people? You want to just try and do the best you can with the choices you've got, and maybe you want to unpack sort of 2 areas: somatic experiencing or somatic therapy and your internal family systems, in terms of possibly those 2 modalities being your favorite modalities or your most areas that you're the most expert in. Obviously, EFT, EMDR, any of these other techniques you want to possibly look at or unpack. But what, where, and how, and the tools and the strategy can you give people listening out there that are living in Africa or abroad that have gone through trauma and are living in that environment of sort of possible trauma?
Sure. And I mean, big disclaimer, really easy for me to sit where I'm sitting right now and point and say, here's what you should do. And if we're going to drill all the way down, the answer is, I don't know. I don't. I can give you the tools and techniques of somatic work. I can give you tools and techniques of IFS work. But I would say, number one, regardless of who you are, where you are, let's start with validating. Because when you're in a high level traumatic situation, like the one you just described, there is no room for shame or self-blame or doubting whether or not your brain is actually on your side, because you need every single ounce of emotional and psychological and physiological energy to manage this environment and the circumstances. You have a little more wiggle room when you're totally safe and you have all of the menu of options in the world. That's not you. There's no room for shame. Your body is on your side, your brain is on your side, and your body's doing its damnedest to help keep you alive. Let's just start with the problem is not inside you. The problem is outside. That reframe right there sometimes is enough to get from one breath to the next. And so let's start there. No room for shame. What's wrong with me? Absolutely nothing. Am I crazy? Absolutely not. There's no such thing as a crazy person. So let's just take all of that chatter off the table and look at, here's the environment. So from a somatic experiencing point of view, the task would be, what are your people, places, thoughts, and things that help bring you a little bit, just a few degrees down from really, really amplified? And you're not going to get to safety. We're not looking for safety. We're looking for a 2-degree less bad, a 2-degree turn in the volume dial. People, places, thoughts, and things that help bring you down just a few degrees so you can maintain your cognition. Because when you're in fight, flight, or freeze, all your logic goes completely offline. And you're going to need that, especially if you're in an unsafe environment. So people, places, thoughts, and things, that would be a somatic approach. And that's always, in any moment, that's available. Again, I can't compare my situation to what you're describing, but for me personally, with domestic violence and assault and all of these other traumas, regardless of my level of resource or my level of ability to get to, choice points, I could always start with, what are my people, places, thoughts, or things that'll help me? And I'm not crazy. Sometimes that is enough to get from moment to moment. The IFS model, which I really love, talks about the multiplicity of the mind, which, it makes sense. Every complex system in nature is made up of multiple parts, right? One tree, leaves, branches, bark, roots. One country is made up of mountains and rivers and lakes and different types of land masses and weather patterns. I don't know where we learned that our personality, which is probably the most complex thing I can think of, is this one singular thing. I feel bad. I am anxious. I am broken or crazy or whatever. Let's start with, you have infinite parts of your personality, and given an unsafe situation, you're going to have little child parts that are going to be terrified, adolescent teenage parts that are probably going to be ragingly mad, grown-up parts that are really, compelled to people please and pretend everything is fine. We want to sort and organize all of these parts of our systems so we can get to know them all. So regardless of what's happening in the external, that we can create some sense of home within our psyche, which we can access with lots of practice and lots of trial and error in any given moment. And that is hard. It's possible, but it is difficult.
Wow. Fantastic summary on SE and internal family systems. Wow, that was succinct, and thank you for that. I want to go into a little bit of your backstory as much as you would like to share. And thank you for being vulnerable, opening yourself up and sharing your story in your book and who you are and what happened, from getting involved with a cult to sex addiction to, I think, meth, and carry on. But maybe share what you'd like to share as much as you can. And then just put that in the sort of frame of how you use firstly SE for that, practically how you do that, and then secondly IFS, because it'll give a practical example for people to grab hold of. I just think so many people are stuck, and I just love the name of your book, Science of Stuck. It's just, everybody knows what it feels to feel stuck, and whether it's mentally, emotionally, physically, or holistically all together, a sense of stuckness is a real feeling. So if you could, I'd really appreciate that.
Sure. And there's two very extreme polarities when we're talking about traumatic environments. One is what you described, when the environment historically, culturally, on from the macro down to the microscopic has been plagued and just besieged by traumatic events, where you can see it. Like you can see in certain parts of certain countries, these things are bad, period. No one's going to debate or argue. Like, was it really that bad or was it not that bad? So on the extreme end is trauma that looks like trauma. But because of that, and because people don't like comparing and they don't like feeling, like it really took me a long time to identify my story as traumatic. Even though when you hear it, you're like, wait a minute, sexual assault, then sexual addiction and methamphetamine use and all of the, I was like, well, I'm not living in a war-torn country. What's my problem? I have safety. At the end of the day, I don't have electrified fences surrounding my community. What's my problem? And again, it's not about comparing. It's not about me saying mine is just as bad or the same. It's the fact is my story is my story. Yours is yours. My pain is my perspective on things like safety and privilege and access is good. But perspective allows for multiple realities, including my family looked normal, but there was a lot of really bad stuff happening within what looked like a normal, safe, suburban, family. Not to compare. Perspective is that's true and that's true. Perspective is my bad isn't going to cancel out there's not like a slice of pizza where all of our pain gets put, and if I take one, that's less for you. Like pain and trauma is not a zero-sum game. There's plenty, unfortunately, to go around. So my story was defined by what looked like normal. Then as I grew up, because as a child, what you're exposed to is your normal. You don't realize, oh, wait, not all families do this until you're older. It's like not all families watch pornographic material together. Really? Like you don't do that with your parents? What? And so as I got older and my behaviors became more and more and more unhinged and out of control, that's when I was like, wait a minute, this didn't come out of nowhere. I must be crazy. And then I got into somatic therapy, where a very skilled therapist said, well, there's actually no such thing as crazy, Britt. But I'm like, what do you mean? I have mental illness on both sides of my family. My grandmother was taken to the hospital and given shock therapy by the men in the white coat. Like, clearly I'm crazy. My family is we're just crazy. She said, no, this is trauma. And here's what it means. And here's what your body is actually doing. I was so out of control. I needed DBT to settle the fire before I could really do somatic work. I tried doing somatic work, but you can't do trauma healing while you're on fire. So first DBT, then we started unpacking my story. And SE, somatic experiencing, is at its core about learning to not only tolerate, but befriend all of the body sensations inside you, which are terrifying. But once you start to understand what's happening with a supportive witness, you can move through them. And that's how you metabolize the body sensations. IFS gave me such a beautiful way to not just connect with my body sensations, but to connect with all the different parts of me that experience these traumas. And then one by one, help bring them back home. And I really think healing in any form or formation is about integrating all aspects of ourselves so we can build an internal home, regardless of what's happening in our environment.
Sure. Wonderful. Well done to you. Great journey. Thank God. Just thank God for people that are willing to share. Let's talk about how we can develop sort of skills. Like I've got a 7-year-old, and she's a very, maybe, I mean, this new term I haven't, highly sensitive personality. Is it HSP? Is that what it is? But and I've had a son, and one doesn't want to compare with your parents, and just what it really affects her and causes sort of a strong emotion in her, and really trying to reach out to that emotion, acknowledge that emotion, teach her to acknowledge the emotion and the feeling. And that's not necessarily her, but it is a feeling. How do we train the next generation? And this might sound incorrect, but not to have so many events cause so much trauma wounds inside of them that it causes such dysfunction within a society. Because we do, I mean, seeing your kids going through or experiencing trauma, an event happens and they got this deep wound, and then you got to try and process it and deal with it. And there's so many pressures on children. What would your framework be? What would your steps be with your children? I don't know if you do have children, but how would you sort of bring them up in this crazy world with so many social pressures and so many events that can be traumatic?
Sure. And this trend towards validating all feelings to the point of excusing all behaviors. So we've sort of over-indexed on validation to the point where it's now a synonym with an excuse, and it is not. I do not have children, but I started my career as a play therapist. And I would say to parents, I'm not here to teach you how to parent. I don't know anything about parenting. I'm not a parent, but I am an expert in how children experience their worlds and how they develop and how they communicate and the language of children. So I always say I'm not a parent coach, I'm a child interpreter. And because I don't have kids, I had plenty of time to learn how to do that. So what I found in play therapy, and I worked with some of the most horrific abuse trauma cases that I like, the worst of what humanity can do to its children, I have seen and witnessed. The capacity for children to move through high level trauma is actually pretty incredible. But because adults lack the skills and the resources and the tools and the language, we don't know what to do, right? So again, validating is great, but one of the most powerful tools for helping a child move through a trauma is play. Play is the language of children. Toys are the words. And I'm not talking about recreational play. I'm talking about if you give a child access to someone who's experienced a medical trauma, for example, throw a bunch of dolls and a medical kit in a room, get out of their way and be with them, they will play through that trauma. It's incredibly disturbing to witness, which is why play therapists do what they do. But a child will actually recreate that trauma in the play setting in a way that allows them to achieve a sense of mastery, a sense of winning, or a sense of surviving. I cannot tell you how many times I have been murdered in a play therapy session by a child who is physically abused. And as a parent, they're like, oh my God, like my kid is a sociopath. Like I've had kids tie me up and handcuff me and shoot me and chop me up and put me in a microwave and blow me up. And it's like, how marvelous. Play is like art. Play is a safe space for rage. Play is a safe space for the biggest possible feelings that exist within a child's psyche. Because in play, everything is miniaturized. The child is the biggest, right? Toys are small, child is big. And then no one actually gets hurt. My only rule as a play therapist is you can kill me, but you don't get to hurt me. There's no hurts. You don't get to hurt you, or you don't get to hurt me, but we can pretend whatever you want. And that's not recreational play. That is work. I call that working play. And a child, you'll see them, will do this scene. And then they'll say, okay, Miss Britt, can we play now? And it's like they intuitively know the difference between subjective working through trauma play and play for play's sake. So that's one. And then IFS is actually great for kiddos too, because when a child has a giant trauma-induced feeling, they feel bad. Like kids don't want to be out of control any more than we want them to be out of control. But IFS allows you and the child to partner with the problem instead of the child being the problem. What that looks like practically. Oh my God, whoever, child, kiddo, you're having such a big feeling. It sounds like part of yourself is so scared right now. There's a part of you that's so scared. Okay, how can you and I help this part of you? Quick, let's come up. What are our fire drills to help this part of you? Then the child gets to be the hero of the story instead of the villain. And it's incredible to watch a child strategize and problem solve on behalf of their own sub-personalities. And they can do that if pointed in that direction with that knowledge and that vocabulary.
Britt, brilliant, Britt. Well said, well done, well articulated. Okay, so that's dealing with sort of possible traumatic events. I don't even want to call it traumatic because for some people an event is not trauma inducing. So we got to reframe that. But now how do we build, whether they're children or teenagers, how do we build this next generation to process events in a way that doesn't cause trauma? Because obviously, if you have the skills, you have the mindset, the way you see something. I mean, I love Viktor Frankl's work of logotherapy. I love these sort of systems, but sometimes it's difficult to succinctly put them in a way that can build a foundation. So you want to look at logotherapy, but that should be at the top. Now, you're the expert in this. What is foundational mindset or skills we want to teach the next generation? And does that include sort of emotional intelligence and the 4 parts of emotional intelligence, trying to build those? Where would you go with this if you were teaching and educating the next generation?
Everyone hates this answer that I'm about to give you, but it doesn't make it any less true. The best way to train up a generation of young people is to have grown people who can do this work and model it. Because I can't tell you how many people would come to me saying, fix my kid. And it's like, well, like the best predictor of a child's outcome is a stable adult caregiver. So this is the put your own mask on theory. This is when you're talking about whether it's addiction or trauma or whatever thing you're wanting a child to learn. Children learn by modeling, not by language. Like they'll hear like 1% of what you say, and they will absorb 1,000% of what's unsaid, what's being communicated non-verbally. So the best way to train up a generation of young people is for this current generation of older people to deal with their stuff so they have something to give. It's really hard to train up a child in emotional regulation if you're a dysregulated adult functioning from a childlike part. So we've got a lot of adults running around chronologically grown, but psychologically regressed. And then that's why often you see teenagers and parents butting heads. Like, again, I don't have kids. There's a reason for that. It's hard. Teenagers are, at least when little kids act out, they're cute. So there's a degree to which there's some compassion. But once they become teenagers and they're just, you know, rolling through the home like a tornado, causing havoc, it's really easy for adults to regress to that same emotional state. And then you've got two dysregulated 16-year-olds battling it out for power and control. And you're going to do what I tell you to do. And that doesn't work. So I say to train up the next, let's deal with the ones that we've got that are here, the adults that are here now.
Okay, good. So where would you start with adults then? Do you look at purpose? Do you look at community? Do you look at the 4 steps of emotional intelligence? Where do you start with, where do you the biggest bleeding points that you see in adults or in teenagers that you say, well, if I could change these 2-3 things or start with these 2-3 things, I think these are the biggest sort of gaps and bleeding points.
Yeah, I think the power dynamic and the lack of community, if those 2 things alone could be changed. Like as a parent, when I see parents fighting with their kids, whether it's over bedtime or over doing schoolwork or whatever, and again, it's hard. That's why I've chosen not to do it. I have endless compassion on it. But when adults realize they have all the power, like your child is dependent upon you for their life, you're in control. We need to get some skills. But if we can take this, I am against my child and I have to like battle my child. It's the same fight that we have with our brains. Your brain's not attacking you, and a dysregulated child is doing their best to communicate. So there is no power dynamic. Adults are always more powerful, period. And then the community aspect. I've seen, and the research has shown, that even in the absence of trauma specialists and experts in the field, if you have access to community, to safe people who want to witness and nurture and support you through an event, it's a lot easier to develop. I mean, resilience is best served by community, not even, I always tell people, come to me as a last resort, but let our goal be that you build up a community of people that you have a team on your side to go to for. And again, trauma therapists and therapy, great. Like my job is important. I get that, but I would much rather see people go to their community first because often.
So what does that community need to have, Britt? I know you talk about being in a safe environment. I mean, we've done a lot of these questions corporate wise, people with regards to community. Who do you feel safe with? Who would you call 2 o'clock in the morning repeatedly if you were in an emergency? Who would you leave your children with? Who would you leave your parents with? Who would your parents feel safe with? Who would your children feel safe with? These are really important questions. And if people answer these questions truthfully, there's often maybe 1 or 2 or sometimes no one. So we talk about community and having people sort of validated. They feel safe there. They feel loved there, despite their performance, despite their achievements, not based on their behaviors, but just in who they are. What are those people, those communities need to have? Because like you were in the cult and you were, if you do everything great, you now belong there. And if you don't do all these behaviors, then you don't belong and you excommunicated. So how and what do those communities need to have?
I'm really glad you brought that up because I was thinking as we're talking, I'm like, oh, wait a second. I was watching a documentary last night about these children brought up in this cult. And you could say there's community everywhere. And like, I've experienced that myself. So what do the communities need to have is a good question, but we can start with definitively what they don't need is a power and control and a dogmatic approach to you do this or you're shunned. A true community, in my opinion, is not necessarily all of my friends are not friends with all of my friends. I have community, but my community is split up between online friends with whom I've never spent a day in person and in-person friends that are sort of surface level. Like they're fun, we get coffee, but we don't go too deep. And recovery friends that I've never ever shared about a stressor at work, but I can call at 3 a.m. if I'm about to like jump off a cliff. So community is not necessarily one place with one group of people. Community is defined by the freedom to do whatever you need to do, as long as you're not hurting yourself or other people, to come and go as you please. Community is non-dogmatic, non-rigid, non-control based. I think that's really important. The qualities of community are really dependent upon the person. I am not a day-to-day person. I don't like texting. I don't like talking on the phone. I don't like being in constant contact. I can see my good friends twice a year and that feeds me and I'm good. For someone wired differently, they might need every single day communication with someone, and there's no right or wrong. So rather than what does the community need, I think the easier to nail down question is what's not needed. And control, rigidity, dogma, threat of shunning, threat of being disconnected if you don't do X, Y, and Z. Those are certainly not good things for community.
Okay. What about community, like the people that you trust? Is that something that you would look at? I mean, and how would you define trust? Because trust is like really rare these days. Who you trust I ask this question to many of my patients, clients, who would you trust with all your login details, your banking details, your accounts? Is that something that's lacking out there? I know a lot of the behavioral sociologists in America say that people have like less good friends than they ever have, and they're becoming more isolated, they trust less. And what would you say about trust and just what's happening out there?
I think that the mythology that is driving a lot of the problem is this idea that unconditional trust in every area is something that adults can count on from their adult friends. And that is just not true. Again, I don't have children, but I can think of people that I would trust with. If I did have a child, I would trust them with my life to care for my child, but I wouldn't trust them as far as I could throw them with my banking info. So unconditional trust is just not a realistic expectation in adult relationships. So rather than can I trust this person, it's with what topics can I trust which people? And if we can get rid of this myth that unconditional love and unconditional trust is available, then we have more choice points. Because again, someone that I would trust with a child's life doesn't mean I have to trust them with my aging parents and my banking info and my power of medical and who's going to make the decisions. And so we need to grieve the reality that part of being an adult is unconditional trust and love is something that only a very select group of young people get. I wasn't one of them. I don't actually know any, but I assume somewhere there are children who are raised in enough safety that they have unconditional love and trust. But once you grow up, that ship has long sailed. Unconditional trust is just not realistic. But because we think it is and it should be, we're very quick to write off what would otherwise be really incredible resources for us. There's nothing wrong with parsing out roles and specific lanes to put people in our ecosystem.
So maybe specific trust would be, give us sort of coin a term for us now in the podcast about trust. Coin a term, specific trust or specific areas of trust or something. Give us something.
Steve, you're asking me to coin a phrase. Let's see. Trust specific, role specificity, trust specificity. I don't know. I'm going to need to think on that. But I mean, the quick and dirty is, what roles do we cast your friends like a movie? We need a cast. Okay. We need a cast list.
Yeah.
Right. The role of trusted child caregiver goes to the role of financial confidant goes to the role of 3 a.m. I'm going to go do a drug goes to, and then cast your cast list according to your resources. And if you don't have any, fortunately, we have the internet and online resources count. They do.
Yeah. because I think people are feeling very lonely in those different areas, you know, and I think that when you feel isolated, I'm not saying being alone, but lonely and isolation can cause significant sort of dysfunction and abnormality within a person.
Agree.
Yeah, cool. So let's talk about The Science of Stuck. I know that it's a brilliant book, and I think I'm going to really recommend we'll put all the links in that. But we've probably spoken a lot about what's in the book already. But if you had to just sort of summarize it, because change is, you know, we got other books like How to Change and Sustainable Transformation. And we talk about this at SteveStavs significantly because being a practitioner, you know, for 24 years, 25 years at the end of this year, I see a lot of people come in with disease, dysfunction. You help them, they're like really in a crisis. Then 6 months later, they're back to their normal default settings and they get sick again. And it's just a perpetual cycle. And so we often look at keys, tools, strategies for sustainable transformation. But let's talk about The Science of Stuck, why you called the book that. I think it's really, really important. And how do people really change?
So why The Science of Stuck? Because the word trauma is so incredibly off-putting to people. Not everyone identifies as a trauma survivor. Not everyone identifies as, you know, an injured human. We all know what it's like to be stuck. I don't care who you are. I've talked to people from every single type of area. If you say the word stuck, there's an immediate resonance. I know that feeling. Like, that's a very human experience. Now, we can put, you know, neuroscience terms to it and start to like tease out all of the academics. But I found, as both someone on the recovery from trauma side and the academic side, that those are very siloed arenas where either the information is so academic that it's impossible. Like, I read Jung and I fall asleep. I read neuroscience journals because I had to, and I'm snoozing. It's like, oh wait, this is so boring. Like, what? That's why I turned, you know, the polyvagal theory into a cartoon, because it doesn't need to be that complicated. But on the other side, sometimes things are so fluffy that they don't actually have any weight or substance or point of transformation. So I wanted to write a book that bridged the, you know, you can do it, rah, rah, with the here's what's happening in your brain and body and your nervous system in a very tangible, practical way. The other thing I did with this book that I needed, I wrote this book because it's the one I wish I had had when I started, was that you can like nail down one particular area of your life, but all of a sudden, if you don't, and we're holistic beings, you can't just do nutrition. You can't just do nervous system regulation. You can't just do relational effectiveness. If you don't have the map for what it all looks like together, then you can get mastery in one area, but these other areas will quickly become an undertow. And that's why you end up right back where you started. So The Science of Stuck covers in a very high level. This is not the deep dive book. This is here's what the map generally looks like with your brain, with relationships, with your body, with family of origin, with grief and loss, with transformation. Here are all the pieces, and here are just the bottom lines that I think are the most important. So I wrote the book. So if you don't want to read, and my favorite feedback that I've gotten from people who bought the book is, I don't read books, but I liked yours because I could get through it. Like, I don't read ever, but your book, yay. And someone said, your stupid brain book is stuck in my head, and now I can't stop thinking about it. And that made me happy. But there's also a deep dive available. I put footnotes with little trailheads to everything that I'm referencing. So if you want a deeper dive, it's available. But it's like, you can crack open the book in any order. You don't have to read start to finish. And there's going to be a nugget that will then start to click the puzzle into place and then make whatever choices are available to you. I really wanted here's everything in a nutshell, just high level, not everything, but here are the main points in a nutshell, so you can see why certain things might not be working. And I want people to read it and go, oh, this makes sense. I'm not crazy. Crazy is just not a thing. There's no such thing as a crazy person.
Oh, fantastic. Well done. Tell us a little bit about, got a data-centric model at SteveStavs with an intersection of human capital, people like yourself, health coaches, health consultants, psychologists, and so psychiatrists as well, psilocybin, ketamine, a lot of that type of stuff. But what health data points, heart rate variability, known as HRV, or functional medicine? I've been doing functional medicine for 17 years now, looking at all the factors that are really, really important for a balanced neural system. But what are the important ones that you really think people should do that are really important data points or health assessments?
I think starting with basic biological necessities. So if
Mm,
someone comes into my office with a trauma history a mile long, this happened recently, and I'm not a nutritionist, I am not a functional medical professional, I am in my lane, but I know
mm,
enough to know to
mm,
ask, what does your diet look like? I
mm,
drink 2 pots of coffee a day, I smoke a pack of cigarettes, and occasionally I'll eat candy.
mm,
There's nothing I can really do for a person in that state because our
mm,
psychological well-being largely depends on our physiological state. And the easiest point of change often is our
mm,
physiological state. The psyche is a very complex thing. Coffee and cigarettes and candy to perhaps eat a vegetable, eat an apple, or just eat solid food with something resembling a nutrient in there. Those are often easier gets, and that often creates the infrastructure for these deeper level
mm,
transformation points to occur. So I said to that person, you actually probably need like a functional medicine assessment and a dietitian before any of our work is going to be even helpful or
yeah.
healthy, because trauma work can be incredibly
Mm,
dysregulating. If you don't have the physiological supportive system built first, then it could actually be contraindicated and cause more
mm,
harm than good.
mm. It's like getting the flames down off the building, or getting the people out straight away when there's just no nutrition or no assessments or nothing like that. Great. And then the last question that I have for you, just sustainable transformation. We've been asking guests, I think we've got 165 episodes, or why people just go back to their default settings, they lose their diet, their exercise, or, they don't apply sort of emotional intelligence techniques or DBT, or they stop their EFT or their massage or their acupuncture or things that help them, and they just really go back into a state of dysfunction. Disease comes 6 months, 9 months, a year later. What are your keys or strategies for sustaining transformation?
Hmm. And I'm big on, when people are like, I'm just lazy, I'm just an addict. I'm like, what? Those are personality traits, but what those actually are physiological states. So when we mistake trait for state, then we're going to get stuck because we think it's just, I just can't stick to a diet because that's who I am. I'm like, this is not a personality trait. This is a physiological state. So let's
Mm-hmm.
start with the assumption that
Yeah.
yes, you can change. I think the default setting, first and foremost, is a function of lack of safety. So that's the first thing to rule out. When I was trying to get out of a violent relationship, yeah, there were a lot of things going wrong that I had no bandwidth to address. I wasn't going to sit there and journal and meditate and eat
Mm,
my morning green juice or anything like that. So that's one. But the secret one that I think gets less spoken about is
mm,
often we default to our usual whatever because there are benefits to doing it. Again, our brains are not wired for success, they're wired for survival. My brain is organized to conserve as much energy as possible and to keep me alive. So if there's and people get very upset, and I get it. It's like, how could you say that there's a benefit to me being addicted to methamphetamine or to being in a horrible relationship? And it's not about assigning blame. There's no victim blaming here. It's just, for me personally, being addicted to drugs and in bad relationships was a way to bypass my own personal narrative. If I'm with someone that's doing horrible things, all my focus can be on how terrible they are. Doesn't mean I chose it or deserved it. It just means there was a benefit to it. A benefit to being drug addicted. When you're on speed, you're moving really fast and your reality has no time to catch up to you because you are going 20,000 miles an hour with your hair on fire. So we need to not just count the costs, because everyone's like, I want to lose weight, I want to get fit, I want to quit doing drugs because it's costing me my health, got it. But just like in business, no business survives without a cost benefit analysis. With our wellness, we cover the benefit column, we list out the cost, but if we're not changing, it's because there are benefits in that column that we need to address without shame. The ability to look at the benefit column without shaming ourselves is what drives sustainable change, in my
of the
opinion.
benefits of looking at change. Just repeat that, because I think that was a profound statement, because it tells me as I'm listening that I have to take accountability. Actually, it's up to me. And I think that's a lot of work and that's really hard. So repeat that statement, because I think we're going to use it in social. I think it's really important.
Yeah, I'll try to say what I said again. I'm glad we're recording. So all businesses have a cost benefit column. In wellness, we cover the benefit column and we just look at the costs of our behavior. But if we're looking at all the costs of our behavior, nevertheless, the behaviors continue, that means there are benefits that we need to actually look at. The ability to look at your benefit column without shaming yourself is what drives sustainable change. All behavior, even suboptimal behavior, has a benefit or it wouldn't be present. Those behaviors are sticky because they are giving something to us. Doesn't mean that they're good. It just means that they are benefiting us in some way. And we need to be able to ruthlessly examine without shame the benefits to even the most maladaptive behaviors, because doing that is what creates sustainable change.
Wow.
Period.
Well said. And do you think the greatest benefit is it just takes less energy? Those behaviors take less energy than the benefit column?
I think the mythology there is that it's easier. It's just so hard to get fit. It's just so hard to go to the gym. It's just so, but it's like, it's hard to get fit. It's hard to be unwell. Choose your hard. It's really hard to get financially literate and figure out what's going on with your money and how you're spending it. But it's also really hard to be in debt and feeling underwater every single month. Choose your hard. So if we can dispel the myth that there's an easy, there is no easy. There are two hards. There is the hard that is circular that leads to nowhere. And there is the hard that eventually gets you to the end zone. Choose your hard. So if we can take out the, it's just easier not to, like, that's crap. It's hard both ways. Choose your hard.
Wow. Well articulated, well communicated. Thank you so much. Where can people connect with you? I know your Instagram channel is amazing. Your book is incredible, but are there any other sort of links we can put in the show notes or where people can connect with amazing Britt Frank?
Thank you so much. I really appreciate this conversation and your work. My website, scienceofstuck.com. You can buy the book wherever you buy books, and my Instagram, where I am spending way too much time and having way too much fun. So come and say hello. I don't have a team. I do that all myself, and I love meeting everybody who comes to join this wellness movement.
Cool. What is your handle, Britt?
At Britt Frank.
At Britt Frank. Well, I want to declare favor and blessing over you, that you would just soar with eagle's wings, that you would just be so courageous like you've been, and your calling is so precious, and your book is amazing. And so we need more people like you, and it's been an honor to have this time with you, and I look forward to more collaboration and connection. And yeah, Britt Frank, go, 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 girl. You're a powerful woman, and you've got self-awareness and regulation and know what's happening out there. So thank you so much.
Received with gratitude. Thank you.